As you may recall, world leaders and scholars think about international relations using a variety of perspectives. Each perspective has a particular attitude about how international relations works, and certain prescriptions about how actors are supposed to respond to international events. The second oldest international relations perspective is known as liberalism, or the liberal perspective. This mini lecture is going to introduce you to some of the major concepts that define this alternative to realism. You may recall that one of the ways in which you can sort of distinguish between perspectives and sort of which perspective perhaps you hold is to ask yourself the simple question, is war between nations inevitable? Realists answer this question in the affirmative. They say, yes, of course, war between nations is inevitable. Liberals, on the other hand, were the first to really question this inevitability, and made very different observations about how the international system worked and made different prescriptions about how states should behave. Before getting further into sort of how liberals reached this conclusion, what those observations and assumptions were, we need to take a step to the side for a moment and look at the concept of liberalism itself. Liberalism is a term that is used in a variety of contexts, both within political science as well as in popular discourse. And so this presents a challenge because students often have a preconception about what the word liberal means in a different context and apply that to international relations. So we want to be very clear that we're using a very specific definition that is related but does not, is not the same as other ways which you might have heard or used the term liberal, either in political science or in popular discourse. So liberalism can mean first a political ideology that favors economic and personal freedom over economic equality. This is liberalism as an ideology. This is the most common usage of the term outside of the United States, but it's not the term we're using here. A second way, and one which is probably the one that leaps to your mind in most cases in the United States, is thinking about it in terms of a political attitude that defines support for changing to the status quo of the country, society, the economy. So in the United States, we equate liberal meaning the left in political politics. So President Obama is a liberal. But in reality, there's other definitions of the word liberal, and that's not what we're talking about here. We're separating it from that. The third perspective, definition of liberal, the one that we are concerned with, is the idea that that through repetitive relationships, you can build institutions that resolve international conflict. So the key for us is the notion of thinking about how actors are going to interact repeatedly, and through those interactions can change, create cooperation and end conflict. Right? So set aside the ideological and the sort of political attitude stuff. It's not relevant to our discussion in this class. So returning to this question, is war between nations inevitable? Again, liberals answer this question with a no. The sort of liberal perspective says no, war between nations is not inevitable. There has to be a solution to perpetual conflict. There are 10 essential concepts that the liberal perspective uses to make sense of international relations. And just as previously, you may want to pause the video at this point in order to write these down and to look for the definitions in your textbook or online. Realists make certain assumptions about how the international system, functions. Liberals make different assumptions, and because they make those different assumptions, different observations, they've reached very different conclusions about how the world works. And that's what makes them separate perspectives, is that they see the world differently because they have different underlying beliefs and assumptions about how the world functions. The first observation that liberals make is the idea that anarchy has been overcome in certain contexts, domestic politics and cities, and villages and communities throughout history, by the centralization and the legitimization of power in institutions. Right? Institutions are structures and mechanisms of social order and cooperation that govern collective behavior. So there are ways in which people regulate their interactions with one another. And liberals point out, truthfully, that historically there has been greater and greater cooperation among human beings by the creation of larger and more effective institutions. So the assumption is that anarchy exists, but it can be overcome. Anarchy used to be much bigger, in terms of cover much more of the relationships between human beings than it does now. So the underlying reason or belief of why this happens, why anarchy can be overcome, is that liberals believe that humans behave on the basis of how other groups or individuals behave towards them. Right? This is called reciprocity, and it's the foundation of a huge number of religious texts. For example, the idea of the golden rule, right? Treat others how you want to be treated. That's the foundation of reciprocity. If everyone is acting according to that rule, you get along pretty well, and everyone sort of benefits for the most part. So their assumption is that human beings generally want to have reciprocal relationships, will act peacefully the first time they meet someone, and then, from that are able to build trust. And as that trust builds, as the interactions increase, you get their third assumption or observation, which is that the more frequent and intense the interactions are, the more mutually dependent those actors are going to be on, to each other, and this creates interdependence. So if you're interdependent with someone, it means that you have some kind of mutual dependence. Each one of you depends on the other, and the greater that interdependence, the less likely it is that you're going to break the norm of reciprocity, because you don't want to endanger that interaction, that dependence, losing what it is that you're dependent on the other one for, and as a result, you cooperate even more. So the goal of liberalism in the long term, which we'll talk about, is to build more interdependence. Right? The more interdependence, the less conflict. If you make everyone sufficiently interdependent, there won't be any more conflict. Take a quick look at how this sort of might function. Assume we have 3 states. Each one has some commodity that they're trying to sell because they've already consumed as much of it domestically as they possibly can. Each state says, hey, let's do something about this. And so state A, state C decide to exchange money, and they make a little cash. State B wants to get in on the action, and so they start trading. States B and C, decide they're going to start trading, and they get on the action, and they just keep building up. And so they're generating more and more interdependence, by making new trade relationships. They're benefiting reciprocity-wise, in terms of each side is gaining some money, and it creates the impression, right, sort of the opposite of the version, where we get a security dilemma, where state A, state B, state C, they're not going to want to go to war with each other because it's going to disrupt this trade. They're going to lose out money. They're going to have less money than they would have if they just kept trading sort of peacefully. So liberals view international institutions as the mechanism through which you can engender more of this interdependence, right? Overcoming conflict in other contexts required creating institutions. So overcoming conflict in internationally requires international institutions, which can then manage interdependence and can increase that interdependence in different ways. A sort of step in the long term is that you can have sort of informal as well as formal institutions. International regimes are often very sort of informal institutions that help to coordinate the expectations and behaviors of states prior to the creation of formal rules. And you will find within society that whenever sort of a new challenge emerges, some new thing happens, that there's a struggle among actors to try to figure out what kind of behavior resolved the conflict. So when cell phones were first invented, we need to come up with some etiquette and what's the courteous thing to do? What are your manners when you're interacting with each other? Those manners are an example of a domestic regime that's designed to sort of coordinate expectations of behavior. There's not necessarily a law behind it that says you must do this, here's the penalty, but there's an expectation that you will behave in a certain way, and so social pressure bears on you to sort of behave according to a certain way. And states, from the perspective of liberals, operate in this same kind of view. There would be pressure on them to behave in certain ways because they'll be looked at negatively by other states. Once international regimes, once international institutions, even more formal institutions have been established to deal with sort of problems that arise, states tend to continue to comply with them because they allow for the pursuit and the development, procurement of collective goods, which are goods that are very costly to produce, And so there's kind of a disincentive to try to produce them. But at the same time, there are also goods which everyone can benefit from, whether or not they paid any of the cost of producing it. So, collective goods are, difficult to achieve, but they're very important, they're very beneficial, and so states provide them for their citizens, and in the same context, liberals are saying there has to be a way of producing those at the international level. One of the most important goods, collective goods that could be established, it's questionable really how well this has ever been achieved, but this is the end goal, would be something known as collective security, which is in a sense when everyone feels safe because no one is a threat to anyone else. This is the opposite of the security dilemma, and this is being able to feel secure no matter what everybody else does. Right? If you have true collective security, there's no conflict. Liberals think collective security is something you can achieve, and since that's true, war cannot be inevitable. Right? It is not inevitable. How it functions is pretty straightforward. Collective security is about creating institutions and alliances that get a majority of the world's power, we call this preponderance of power, united against anybody who might be seen as a threat, right? Anyone who's threatening international peace. In this example, we have two states who have joined together in a collective security arrangement. They don't have a preponderance of power, and so they are still threatened by other states. But if they can get just one more state to hop in to their collective security arrangement, they now have a preponderance of power. And now it doesn't matter what the relative power is between those three countries in the alliance. As long as they maintain more power collectively than those on the outside, they'll be secure and safe. And the assumption is that over time, other states will join in because they'll reap the benefit and be able to have a smaller military and things like that. There are a few additional points we should make about liberalism, just so that you have sort of a complete picture of how it's supposed to operate, or sort of how liberals see it operating. Liberalism has been sustained historically by the process of modernization. As societies have gotten more complicated and they have brought new actors into politics, this has happened, at the sort of state, sort of domestic level for a long time, and now is happening at the international level. And so liberalism, views this change as being a significant mechanism for, increasing the power sort of states in the international system. Non-state actors have, one of the biggest proliferations though of modernization has been the creation of non-state actors, people who have some sort of political power, authority, but who are not the state. And these non-state actors form a civil society. The civil society in turn has bolstered transnational relationships. So you have more actors in the system thanks to modernization, and these actors are interacting with one another, which in turn has increased the level of interdependence. So you have more interdependence, not just between states, but between other actors. And again, the more interdependence you have overall, the less likely conflict is to be. And the third point, and again, sort of remarkable, evidence of liberals' point to look, the world is changing. It's not entirely just simply this kind of pessimistic place that realists envision it to be, is that non-state actors have changed, have expanded our definition of security beyond simply the realist conception of it being about state survival to include the idea of human security, so the prosperity of individual people. And this has had a fundamental effect on a number of areas of international relations, which we will look at over the course of the semester.